Hey guys, tonight we're going to step back into a world without refrigerators, where the difference between survival and starvation could be measured in grains not of gold, but of salt. That's right. This humble white crystal, which today costs a few cents at the grocery store, was once more precious than silver in many parts of the world. In the Middle Ages, salt wasn't just a seasoning, it was strategy, power, economy, and even spirituality, all packed into tiny flakes that kept society ticking. So, before you get comfortable, take a moment to like the video and subscribe, but only if you genuinely enjoy what I do here. Also, drop your location and the local time in the comments. I love seeing where these bedtime journeys find you. Now, dim the lights, maybe turn on a fan for that soft background hum, and let's ease into tonight's journey together. You trudge through the muddy lanes of a medieval village, the air thick with wood smoke and the smell of livestock. It's late autumn, and preparations for winter are in full swing. You pass a butcher hanging slabs of meat from wooden pegs, but something's missing. There's no buzzing of flies. That's because the meat is coated in salt, curing slowly to last through the lean months ahead. Salt isn't a flavor enhancer here. It's a lifeline. In a world before refrigeration, salt preserved food. Meat, fish, cheese, even vegetables, in some cases, could be salted and stored, feeding families through the depths of winter or on long journeys. Without salt, the food would rot. With it, you could trade, travel, and plan. In fact, entire military campaigns depended on salted rations. Armies couldn't march without it. Imagine knights loading barrels of preserved pork onto their supply carts before setting off on crusade. Without those barrels, no battle. Mainstream historians agree that salt preservation was the cornerstone of medieval logistics. Take cod, for instance. Salted cod, known as bacalhau or stockfish, was a dietary staple across Europe, even in landlocked regions. It was cheap, abundant, and could last for months. The Catholic Church played a surprising role here too, encouraging fish consumption during Lent and other fast days. That meant demand for salt skyrocketed, and with it, so did its price. You walk into the village storehouse, where huge sacks of salt are kept under lock and key, not because they're dangerous, because they're valuable. This is no ordinary mineral. In medieval Europe, salt was sometimes called white gold, and it was taxed accordingly. In France, the gabelle, a tax on salt, became so hated and so heavy-handed that it helped spark the French Revolution centuries later. But even before that, kings and lords grew rich by controlling salt production and trade. In regions like Venice, Genoa, and the Bay of Biscay, salt was big business. Coastal salt works essentially shallow ponds where seawater was evaporated by the sun were guarded like treasure vaults. Inland, salt mines like those in Holstadt, Austria, and Wieliczka, Poland, became major sources of wealth and employment. People literally carved out their living day by day in the darkness of the earth. A quirky tidbit: in medieval Ethiopia, salt blocks called a mole served as currency. Yep, people used slabs of salt to buy goods like early debit cards made of sodium chloride. That shows you how much salt was tied to value. You sit beside a monk in a chilly monastery kitchen, watching him sprinkle salt over the evening stew. Salt wasn't just practical, it was sacred. In Christianity, it symbolized purity, preservation, and divine wisdom. Jesus referred to his followers as the salt of the earth. In medieval churches, salt was sometimes used in baptismal rites, rubbed onto the lips of newborns to protect them spiritually. Salt was also bound up in superstition. Spill some? That was bad luck. Why? Because salt was expensive. It wasn't just a mess, it was wasteful, maybe even disrespectful to the divine. People tossed a pinch over their shoulder to ward off evil spirits, a tradition that still lingers today. Now let's talk power. Whoever controlled the salt roads controlled the economy. Trade routes crisscrossed Europe, Africa, and Asia like veins, pumping salt to where it was needed most. One of the most famous was the Via Salaria in Italy, which supplied Rome for centuries. In West Africa, the salt-gold trade linked Saharan salt mines with the gold-rich regions of Ghana and Mali. Caravans carried salt on camelback across blistering dunes, each grain worth its weight in gold, literally. You picture a medieval map, its edges curled and ink faded. There's a trail of dots across the Sahara, tiny fortresses marking oasis towns, where salt bricks were stacked in open-air markets. Entire cities rose from this trade like Timbuktu, which became a beacon of culture and scholarship, all thanks to salt. Historians still argue whether salt alone could topple kingdoms or fuel empires. Probably not. But could it tip the balance? Absolutely. During the 100 Years' War, access to salt was crucial for provisioning armies. In times of siege, the first thing a city might lose wasn't water, it was salt. And with it, morale. You step into a medieval kitchen again, this time in a castle. The cook is preparing salt-crusted fowler delicacy for nobles who had more salt than they knew what to do with. The lower classes used it sparingly, more likely to stretch their salt across weeks of bland pottage. The taste of salt was the taste of class. So, tonight, as you reach for the salt shaker at dinner, take a moment to appreciate its quiet legacy. You're holding a miracle in your handen that preserved empires, sanctified rituals, and flavored not just food, but history itself. Now that you know salt was literally worth its weight in silver, and then some, you're probably wondering, how exactly did people in the Middle Ages get their hands on this precious white stuff? Spoiler, it wasn't easy. And definitely not cheap. In fact, acquiring, producing, and transporting salt was one of the most logistically challenging operations of the medieval economy. It involved sweaty peasants, strategic kings, grumpy merchants, and even a few pirates. Let's start with the basics. Where did salt actually come from? There were two primary types of salt in the medieval world, rock salt and sea salt. Rock salt, or halite, came from underground deposits formed by ancient evaporated seas. Miners would tunnel into these salty earth veins with iron tools, digging out great hunks of mineral to be ground and sold. One of the most famous medieval rock salt mines still exists today in Poland, the Wieliczka salt mine, which has been in operation since the 13th century. Picture this candlelit caverns deep underground, with laborers chipping away at glittering walls that taste like potato chips if you dare to lick them. Don't actually try that. Then there was sea salt. This came from evaporating seawater in large, shallow ponds known as salt pans. The process was simple in theory. Let the sun do the work. The reality? Backbreaking labor, constant maintenance, and a whole lot of wheelbarrowing. Entire coastal towns, like Guérande in France and Venice in Italy, were built around these salty marshes. In fact, Venice got so rich in part because it dominated the salt trade in the Mediterranean, something your history teacher probably forgot to mention while talking about gondolas. But just because salt came from the sea or a rock doesn't mean it came easy. Medieval salt production was seasonal, weather-dependent, and highly localized. You couldn't just grab a sack of salt at the nearest corner store, and that scarcity meant distance mattered a lot. The farther you were from a salt source, the more expensive your salt became. That's where things got really spicy, figuratively speaking. Salt had to be moved by cart, riverboat, camel, mule, and even sled, depending on the region and season. And every step of that journey added cost, risk, and a few grumbling toll collectors who wanted their cut. Enter the salt roads. Yes, that's a real term. Salt roads, or salt routes, were dedicated trade networks stretching across Europe, Africa, and Asia, specifically designed to transport salt from source to table. One of the most famous was the Via Salaria in ancient Rome, which remained important through the medieval era. Another was the Trans-Saharan trade route, where caravans of camels hauled salt slabs across the desert from mines in Tegaza, modern-day Mali, to the markets of Timbuktu. Imagine crossing a 1,000-mile desert with nothing but salted fish in your pack, and a prayer that your camel didn't keel over. That was life for a medieval salt trader. And it wasn't just laborers and merchants in the mix. Salt was such a critical resource that governments and warlords got heavily involved. In medieval France, for instance, the monarchy implemented the Gebel, a salt tax that became one of the most hated and resisted policies of its time. It was mandatory for every citizen to buy a certain amount of salt at a state-fixed price from state-approved dealers, no exceptions. If that sounds like a recipe for corruption and smuggling, it absolutely was. Salt smuggling became a booming underground business with secret tunnels and disguised barrels, and smugglers risking prisoner worse for a chance to make bank. Meanwhile, in Germany, powerful merchant guilds like the Hanseatic League controlled access to key salt works and shipping routes. Salt became a tool of diplomacy and dominance. If your town didn't cooperate with the League's pricing or policies, they might just cut you off. No salt meant no preserved food, which meant winter famine. That's medieval extortion at its finest. Even the church wasn't above the salt game. Monasteries often managed salt works and collected salt rents from tenants. In some regions, tithe payments, a religious tax, could even be made in salt. That's right. Giving your priest a nice sack of salt might just save your sulor, at least your seat at Sunday Mass. Salt also caused wars, not metaphorically, literally. The Salt War of 1540 in Perugia, okay, just outside the Middle Ages but still relevant, broke out when Pope Paul III raised the price of salt in the Papal States. The people of Perugia refused to comply, and boom rebellion, the Pope sent troops. Salt may preserve food, but it doesn't preserve peace. So, what happens when everyone wants salt, but only a few control it? Monopolies, tensions, and an arms race of storage. That's right, salt storage was big business. You couldn't just dump your precious crystals in a hole and hope they stayed dry. Salt absorbs moisture like a sponge. So medieval towns built fortified salt, bonds massive stone warehouses with ventilation, guards, and sometimes even moats. In fact, in some European cities, salt stores were more heavily guarded than the treasury. If the salt spoiled or got stolen, the entire town's food supply and winter survival was at risk. All of this points to one core truth. In the Middle Ages, salt wasn't a luxury. It was infrastructure. Its production required skilled labor. Its transportation demanded reliable trade networks. Its storage called for engineering and security, and its taxation sparked revolt. No other seasoning has ever had such impact, not even chili flakes. As your boat floats gently past medieval river towns in your imagination, picture a barge loaded with gleaming white salt, rowers straining against the current, a priest blessing the shipment, and a toll officer waiting to collect a tithe. That's the level of complexity salt added to society. And we haven't even touched on what they did with it yet. You've traveled the salt roads, seen the salt barns, and heard the whispers of smugglers dodging the gabelle. Now it's time to dig into the heart of the matter. What did people actually do with all that salt in the Middle Ages? Here's the short answer: almost everything. Salt was the Swiss army knife of medieval life. From preserving food to purifying souls, it played a role in daily routines, feasts, funerals, farming, and even the occasional exorcism. Let's start with the most critical function, the one that quite literally kept people alive through winter: preservation. Before refrigeration, or ice boxes, or even root cellars that worked properly, salt was the only game in town when it came to keeping meat, fish, and sometimes even vegetables from spoiling. Picture this. It's late autumn in a French village. The cows are being slaughtered before winter hits. The meat can't all be eaten fresh, so it gets salted. Chunks are packed tightly in barrels with layer after layer of coarse salt, which draws out moisture and creates an environment too hostile for bacteria to party in. The result? Salted beef, salted pork, salted herring, salted everything. Mainstream historical fact: preserving meat with salt wasn't just common, it was essential. Without it, winter would mean starvation for countless families. Cities depended on regular deliveries of salted fish, especially during Lent, when the church forbade meat. In some parts of Europe, people ate more salt-preserved fish than fresh even when they lived near rivers or coasts. And that fish? It traveled. The North Sea herring trade alone powered the economies of the Low Countries and parts of Scandinavia. Boats hauled salted fish across Europe, feeding the devout and the hungry alike. But salt wasn't just practical, it was political. In some medieval towns, salted meat and fish was so vital that they became regulated by law. Guilds managed everything from the salting technique to the barrel size to prevent fraud. There were even salt inspectors, officials tasked with making sure your salted mackerel didn't smell like a sewage pipe. Imagine a world where quality control meant licking a piece of cod and declaring it fit for nobles. That's a badge of honor and possibly a stomachache. And here's your quirky tidbit. In Iceland, people preserved food not just with salt, but by burying it in the ground-fermented shark. Anyone? A reminder that not every culture had salt to spare. Where it was scarce, people got creative. Salt also helped preserve dairy products. You ever wonder how medieval people managed to make cheese last more than a week? Salt. Curdled milk plus time equals cheese. But salt made it possible to store, age, and trade cheese far from the original cow. In fact, some cheeses like Roquefort or Parmesan originated in monasteries that relied on salt to maintain food stores through long fasting seasons. Beyond food, salt crept into agriculture. Farmers added it to soil in tiny quantities to kill weeds. They rubbed it into animal hides before tanning. Bakers used it to control yeast in dough. It was a crucial ingredient in ink, dye, and even early glass production. It may not sound glamorous, but without salt, your medieval outfit wouldn't hold its color, your parchment might mold, and your bread could puff up like an overachieving sponge. But salt wasn't just physical, it was spiritual. In Christian Europe, salt took on sacred meanings. It symbolized purity, incorruptibility, and the covenant between God and man. At baptisms, a pinch of salt was sometimes placed on the tongue of infants to protect them from evil. In monasteries, Salt was used in rituals to drive out demons, cleanse the air, and purify holy water. Some even believed salt could ward off witches. Sprinkle some across your threshold, and voila! No broomstick landings tonight. Historians still argue whether these religious salt rituals were deeply held beliefs or convenient customs inherited from pre-Christian traditions. Likely, they were both. After all, salt had been revered long before the Church arrived. Ancient Romans considered salt sacred, and many pagan cultures offered it to the gods. The symbolism extended to the dinner table. To be above the salt in noble households meant sitting near the host, the place of honor. The salt cellar, a decorative container for the precious mineral, often stood in the center of the table, dividing the room into high and low status. If you were below the salt, you were literally and socially in a lower rank. So yes, even salt could insult you. And then there were the superstitions. Spill the salt? You'd better toss some over your left shoulder to blind the devil. Why left? Because that's where evil spirits were thought to hover. No one's entirely sure where this belief started, but by the Middle Ages, it was widespread enough that it made its way into paintings and plays. Salt wasn't just seasoning, it was moral insurance. Let's not forget salt's medicinal uses. Medieval doctors prescribed it for everything from sore throats to constipation. Need to clean a wound? Salt water. Got a toothache? Salt paste. Suffering from demonic possession? Salt and holy water. And if none of that worked, well, at least your soul was well seasoned. Salt was even used in burial rites. Bodies were sometimes salted to delay decomposition, especially for royalty being carted long distances before entombment. One famous example? When Edward I died in 1307, his corpse was packed with salt to preserve it for the trip back to London. Nothing says King of England like being turned into beef jerky for the ride home. So yes, when people say salt of the earth, it's not just poetic. Salt truly permeated medieval life, from the cradle to the grave, from the battlefield to the bakery. Imagine a medieval household in winter. The hearth glows softly. A pot of salted stew simmers. The family shares salted cheese and dried fish. A few pinches of salt rest in a carved bowl on the tablinot just for food. But in case of ominous dreams or unexpected guests, outside, snow falls on salted hides stretched for tanning. In the chapel nearby, a monk sprinkles salt into holy water, muttering prayers in Latin. It's all part of the same story. Salt didn't just preserve food, it preserved culture. The scene shifts now. From smoky kitchens and sacred rituals, we turn our gaze outward across borders, along rivers, and deep into the dusty paths worn by countless hooves and wheels. You're about to follow the trail of salt as it transforms from humble mineral into global commodity. Welcome to the highways of history, the salt trade routes of the medieval world. Salt didn't just sit still in its mines or flats. It moved sometimes farther and more often than kings themselves. It was loaded into sacks, barrels, leather satchels, and camel panniers, then hauled across oceans, deserts, mountains, and swamps. In doing so, salt wove itself into the fabric of civilization, connecting empires, fueling economies, and giving rise to entire cities that owed their wealth to this one precious substance. Let's begin in Africa. The trans-Saharan trade routes of West Africa were among the most famous salt highways in history. Caravans of camels, sometimes numbering in the thousands, set off from the salt mines of Tagaza and Taudeni, deep in what is now Mali and Mauritania. These weren't easy treks. Picture months in blistering heat, across barren dunes, with drivers navigating by stars and instinct. Their cargo? Slabs of salt, each one weighing 80 to 100 pounds, stacked like stone books on camelbacks. Why such effort? Because salt was life. And not just for flavor, remember. In equatorial climates, salt loss through sweat can be deadly. For cities like Timbuktu and Gao, salt wasn't just a seasoning, it was currency. Literally, in some parts of West Africa, salt traded ounce for ounce with gold. That's not a metaphor, that's the market. Mainstream historical fact: the Empire of Mali, circa 1235–1600, flourished on this salt-gold trade. Its rulers controlled the trade routes, taxed every caravan, and became unimaginably wealthy. The most famous of them all, Mansa Musa, distributed so much gold on his pilgrimage to Mecca in 1324 that it reportedly destabilized the economies of Egypt and the Levant for years. And where did much of that gold come from? Salt. Now let's head north to Europe. Here, salt flowed through different arteries. The alpine salt mines at Hallstatt and Hallein in Austria had been in use since prehistoric times, but during the Middle Ages, their output boomed. Miners extracted white gold from the mountains, then floated it downriver on wooden barges to cities and ports along the Danube and Rhine. In Germany, towns like Lüneburg rose to prominence thanks to massive brine springs. The salt works there created a bustling economy that reached far into Scandinavia. You can practically hear the shouting of dock workers and the clinking of barrels being loaded onto riverboats. Salt made cities richened not just through its sale, it became a source of taxation and control. Local lords, bishops, and monarchs levied tolls on every wagon load, often sparking bitter disputes. Possessing a salt spring wasn't just lucky, it was political leverage. Nowhere was this clearer than in France. Enter the gabelle. A uniquely French invention, the gabelle was a mandatory state-imposed salt tax, first introduced in the 14th century, and it was brutal. Depending on where you lived, you might be forced to buy a set amount of salt per year even if you didn't need or want it, and you'd pay vastly different rates. In some provinces, salt was cheap. In others, it was outrageously expensive. The result? Smuggling. Lots of it. Salt smugglers became a national nuisance, and the Crown responded with heavy-handed enforcement, special courts, armed patrols, public executions. Historians still argue whether the gabelle did more harm than good. It certainly filled royal coffers, but it also filled prisons. By the time of the French Revolution, hatred of the gabelle was so widespread that its abolition became one of the first acts of the National Assembly in 1790. But in the Middle Ages, it endured, and it shaped lives. Now, take a detour east. In China, salt was equally foundational. The Tang and Song dynasties developed sophisticated methods of salt production, particularly through evaporation pans and drilling brine wells. More importantly, they turned salt into a powerful tool of governance. The state-controlled salt monopoly was one of the Chinese Empire's largest revenue streams at times, accounting for half of total tax income. This money funded armies, infrastructure, and bureaucracy. In essence, China taxed salt to build its empire. The administration of salt was so complex that entire offices, registers, and careers were built around it. Inspectors were dispatched to prevent fraud. Quotas were set. Distribution routes were managed with military precision. And yes, people cheated anyway. Black markets bloomed. But the principle remained. Salt was too valuable to be left in private hands. Meanwhile, the Islamic world connected all of these regions. Muslim traders carried salt across North Africa and into the Arabian Peninsula. In the Eastern Mediterranean, port cities like Alexandria and Tripoli served as waypoints in a grand salt loop that circled the known world. Salt was both cargo and currency, both commodity and contract. And let's not forget Venice, that shimmering republic of merchant oligarchs floating in the Adriatic became fabulously wealthy through control of salt. Venetian fleets didn't just ferry spices and silk. They hauled salt from the lagoons and salt pans of Chioggia and Servia, then resold it across the Balkans and into Central Europe at steep markups. Some historians even argue that Venice's early success rested more on salt than on silk. Here's your quirky fact. In medieval England, workers on royal salt pans were sometimes paid in salt rations, rather than giving rise to the term salary, from the Latin salarium. That's right, your paycheck owes its name to this ancient mineral. You arrive now at the realization that salt, like language or religion, formed invisible lines across the map. Where it came from determined wealth. Where it passed through determined power. Who controlled it decided war and peace. And along the way, it helped shape global systems that echo even today. At a dusty market near a riverbank, you picture a merchant weighing salt against spices, beads, or silver coins. Children watch wide-eyed as a caravan unloads glittering blocks. Strangers haggle in half a dozen tongues, and the scent of distant shores drifts through the fabric stalls. Salt wasn't just traded, it connected. And tomorrow, we'll explore how that connection gave rise to something else rebellion. You stir from a light sleep and find yourself not on the open road of trade caravans anymore, but under the creaking timbers of a castle's high-beamed ceiling. It's the 14th century. The world smells of wet wool, smoke, and bread. But something else is stirring in the air. Not incense, not stew, something sharper, salt and politics. Tonight, you'll see that salt wasn't just traded, taxed, or treasured. It was contested, and sometimes it was outright stolen, smuggled, or fought over. Welcome to the salty roots of rebellion. Let's start in France. Under the Gabelitha dreaded salt tax we explored earlier. Remember how the state mandated salt purchases? Well, those laws didn't sit quietly. They sparked entire underground economies. Imagine dark forests, narrow trails, smugglers with sacks slung low, their breath fogging in the night. These were the faux sauniers, or salt smugglers, and they weren't rare. In fact, they were so common that whole towns turned a blind eye or actively helped them. In Brittany, Provence, and other border regions, local farmers hid barrels in cellars. Children acted as lookouts. Even clergy sometimes aided the smuggling. Some villages became known for little else. Enforcement was harsh confiscation, fines, imprisonment, public beatings, but that only fueled the resentment. Here's your mainstream historical fact. The gabelle became so reviled that when the French Revolution began in 1789, the very mention of it in cahiers de doléances, grievance lists, could light tempers on fire. Peasants didn't just want cheaper bread. They wanted the right to flavor it without being shackled by state control. And it wasn't just France. Across the Pyrenees, Spanish salt monopolies had similar effects. In Castile, for example, salt rights were granted to noble families who squeezed the peasantry with rising prices. And in Italy, salt riots in places like Bologna and Milan broke out when prices spiked or access was suddenly restricted. Salt, invisible as it was, became a symbol of everything wrong with elite control. It's not just what you eat, it's who owns your appetite. Now shift to India. Fast forward slightly, true, we're peeking beyond the medieval era here, but it's impossible not to mention what salt came to mean during the British Raj. The colonial government, beginning in the late 18th century, levied a heavy tax on local salt production and banned individuals from collecting their own. Why? To force them to buy British-controlled salt at inflated prices. And for a while, it worked. Until a man named Gandhi changed that. In 1930, in an act of calculated defiance, Mahatma Gandhi led the Salt Marcher 240-mile journey on foot to the Arabian Sea, where he famously picked up a handful of salt and broke the British monopoly. It was a small act, symbolically massive. That one pinch of sea salt electrified a nation and helped catalyze India's movement toward independence. Back to the Middle Ages. Let's talk smuggling again, this time in England. In the eastern marshes of Kent and Essex, you'll find salt flats that provided brine for centuries. During the reign of Edward I, salt taxes funded wars against Scotland and France. But local salt boilers and merchants often adjusted their production reports, producing more than they declared and selling the surplus quietly. There's even evidence that some coastal towns, especially in Norfolk, kept false accounts for years under the nose of royal agents. And here's your quirky twist. Some salt smugglers didn't just sneak salt, they flavored it. Yes, spiked, salt coated with herbs or spices was easier to disguise and sell at market. It blended in with cooking blends, or was peddled as a medicinal mix. Salt wasn't just the contraband, it became the disguise. Now walk with me through Venice again. We mentioned earlier that Venice built its maritime empire partly on salt, but this power didn't go unchallenged. The Republic of Genoa, Venice's great rival, repeatedly clashed with Venetian merchants over access to key salt markets in the Adriatic and Eastern Mediterranean. The two cities fought wars not over land, but over waterborne trade routes and port taxes. In the War of Chioggia, 1378-1381, Venetian control of salt ports played a crucial role in logistics and diplomacy. Venetian salt wasn't just a good, it was a bargaining chip. Diplomats offered it in treaties, ambassadors measured its value in leverage, and spies watched the salt flows with as much care as troop movements. Over in the Holy Roman Empire, salt also played a part in rebellion, but more subtly. Cities like Salzburg, whose name literally means salt castle, derived wealth and identity from the salt trade. But that wealth bred discontent. The prince archbishops, who ruled the region heavily, taxed peasant salt miners. Eventually, in the 16th century, the miners revolted, an early whisper of labor struggle echoing from underground chambers lined with crystal brine. Even Japan has its own salt saga. In the medieval Sengoku period, when regional warlords clashed in a chaotic dance of loyalty and ambition, salt blockades became political weapons. One famous incident involves Uesugi Kenshin, a daimyo whose enemy, Takeda Shingen, was cut off from salt supplies by another rival. Instead of exploiting the weakness, Kenshin sent his own salt shipments to Shingen, famously declaring that wars should be won with swords, not starvation. Historians still debate whether this story is romanticized, But the phrase stuck salt, even amid war, had its own code of honor. By now, you've likely noticed a pattern. Salt was never just about seasoning food. It was about control over lives, over regions, over futures. It stirred rebellion not just because it was taxed, but because it was intimate. It touched every household, every meal, every wound. To tax salt was to insert the state into the deepest parts of daily life. And when people pushed back, they weren't just fighting over grain or gold. They were fighting for dignity, for independence, for flavor, yes, but also for freedom. So the next time you pass the salt at dinner, remember, it has started wars. It has overthrown policies. It has rallied marches and toppled taxes. And most of all, it has endured quietly, persistently as a marker of both obedience and resistance. Tomorrow, we turn to the battlefield. Not metaphorical rebellion this time, but the logistical, strategic, and sometimes life-saving role salt played in actual medieval warfare. The clanging of swords, the blare of horns, and the muddy churn of boots in the earth. That's the soundscape you're stepping into now. Welcome to the medieval battlefield. But tonight, you're not focused on the weaponry, the armor, or even the generals. You're here for something less romantic, but arguably more crucial. Salt. Yes, really. Salt marched into war with knights and kings, and without it, their campaigns would have crumbled faster than wet parchment. Picture yourself in the year 1212, trudging through the Pyrenees alongside the armies of the Reconquista. Spain is fragmented, kingdoms are clashing, and you, a humble quartermaster, have one task: keep the food edible and the soldiers alive. And salt? It's the MVP of your supply list. Why? Because every army marches on its stomach, and every stomach needs preservation. Let's start with the most practical purpose: meat. In the Middle Ages, armies didn't exactly dine fresh. They traveled with barrel slots of them filled with salted pork, beef, or fish. The salt didn't just season the food, it preserved it, kept it from rotting in the heat of a summer campaign or the frost of a mountain crossing. Salted rations could last weeks, sometimes months, if stored correctly. And while the meat was tough, and sometimes more salt than flesh, it beat starvation. Mainstream historical fact: during the Crusades, provisioning armies required immense planning, and salt was considered one of the top commodities. In the Third Crusade, 1189, 1192, chroniclers mention supply wagons loaded with salted fish and meat. In fact, Richard the Lionheart's army reportedly established salt depots in Cyprus before advancing toward the Levant. You might not think of salt depots as romantic, but imagine fighting a multi-year war with no refrigeration. You'd think twice about your salt budget. Now think beyond food. Salt was also vital in treating wounds. A pinch of salt in water was one of the few antiseptics available before the rise of scientific medicine. Sure, it stung like betrayal, but soldiers knew it could prevent infection. Salt was rubbed into gashes, used in hot compresses, and even sprinkled into battlefield dressings. Painful? Very. Effective? Sometimes. But it was better than gangrene. There's also a more overlooked aspect. Salt kept animals alive. Horses, mules, and oxenth, draft animals of Worrell, required salt licks or salted feed to prevent dehydration and keep their bodies functioning. An army without horses was an army walking toward defeat. So in many medieval military camps, Salt wasn't just a ration, it was a requirement for the entire logistics train. Here's your quirky tidbit. Salt was sometimes included in military pay. Yep, in both Islamic and Christian forces, salt was valuable enough to serve as a barter item or a wage substitute. Some etymologists even link the word salary to salarium, a Roman term for the money paid to soldiers, sometimes to buy salt. While this connection is debated, the link between salt and soldier pay was strong enough to shape language. Now, walk with me into the 100 Years' War. Armies moved across northern France like tides burning, pillaging, besieging. Salted fish from the North Sea and Baltic was a lifeline. During the siege of Calais in 1346, English troops camped for months on end. Without salted rations, disease would have spread even faster through the trenches. The salt allowed for preservation not only of food but morale. No one fights well on an empty or infected stomach. But salt's importance wasn't just logistical, it became strategic. Control of salt works, those coastal pans and inland brine springs, could tilt the balance of power. In northern Italy, the warring city-states of Venice, Genoa, and Milan all fought not just for trade routes, but for control over salt production zones. The Republic of Venice guarded its salt lagoons jealously, treating salt taxes as wartime funding mechanisms. Likewise, in the Baltic, the Hanseatic Ligia powerful commercial alliance held tight control over the salt fish trade, linking it directly to the provisioning of northern European armies. You might say medieval warfare ran on three things: courage, coin, and cured meat. And here's a moment for Islamic military logistics. During the Fatimid and later the Ayyubid periods in Egypt and Syria, salt caravans were organized alongside weapon shipments. The Mamluk Sultanate even regulated salt prices during times of military conscription. In records from Cairo's administrative archives, salt is listed alongside grain and barley as a sensitive wartime commodity. Soldiers in desert regions were issued extra salt rations to prevent electrolyte loss. Desert warfare without salt? That's a shortcut to heat stroke and collapse. Historians still argue whether some castle locations in Europe were chosen primarily for their proximity to salt supplies. While most cite strategic geography, rivers, hills, or trade routes, there's intriguing evidence that salt, pans, or deposits played a role in site selection. After all, what good is a fortress if your garrison starves, or your meat spoils before the enemy even arrives? Salt also showed up in sieges not just inside the walls, but outside them. Blockades often cut off salt supplies first. Deny the enemy food? Cruel. Deny them salt? Strategic. You could reduce an entire stronghold's fighting capacity within weeks by blocking their salted meat access, especially in winter months. And don't forget the cultural symbolic layer. In medieval rituals, salt was used to bless warriors before battle, sprinkled on armor, placed under helmets, even dissolved into ritual drinks. In some Germanic and Slavic traditions, salt symbolized strength and incorruptibility. Sharing salt before battle was a solemn Gesturian oath. Betray a comrade you'd shared salt with? That was sacrilege. So yes, salt was everywhere on the battlefield, not in glory, but in grit. From preserving meat to purifying wounds, from feeding horses to funding armies, salt was the invisible backbone of war. No glory in it, no ballads sung about salted pork. But ask any commander any good one and they'd tell you, without salt, you'd lose long before the fighting began. Now, as we move on from war to wealth, we'll see how salt's role on the battlefield evolved into something even more enduring: state building, taxation systems, and yes, the creation of entire cities. Because the next chapter, it's about how salt made kingdoms rich and left others in ruins. You've left the battlefield behind now. The clang of steel and the taste of blood have faded, replaced by the quiet shuffle of ledgers and the clink of coin. This isn't the front line anymore, it's the counting house, the chancery, the dusty tax office in a stone-walled castle where power is measured not in arrows, but in income. Tonight, you're stepping into the world of salt as wealth salt, as the currency of kings. And believe it or not, that pile of white crystals was once more valuable, pound for pound, than gold. Let's start with something solid: salt taxation. You may not think taxes are thrilling, but in the Middle Ages, salt taxes shaped kingdom sand, ruined them, too. In France, it was called the gabelle, and if you lived there from the 13th century onwards, you probably hated it. Instituted by Philip IV and expanded aggressively by subsequent kings, the gabelle was a mandatory tax on salt. Not just a sale tax, no. You were legally required to buy a certain amount of salt, whether you needed it or not, and pay the royal price for it. That's right, forced salt shopping. Imagine having to buy 3 sacks of salt every year, even if you lived alone and didn't like seasoning your food. Refuse, and you risked a visit from the king's tax agents, often not known for their polite conversation. Mainstream historical fact: the gabelle became one of the most hated taxes in France, and a major grievance leading up to the French Revolution. By the 18th century, smuggling salt was a serious crime. Salt smugglers, called faux sauniers, operated like medieval bootleggers. Punishments ranged from heavy fines to imprisonment and, occasionally, death. It wasn't just about seasoning, it was about sovereignty. This wasn't unique to France. In China, long before and long after the Middle Ages, the state maintained a salt monopoly that funded imperial bureaucracy and military campaigns. The Tang dynasty's famous salt and iron debate weighed ethical concerns over state monopolies, with one scholar warning that overtaxing salt would burden the poor and destabilize society. Spoiler: the tax stayed, and by the time of the Song dynasty, salt revenues made up over half of the government's income. In other words, the empire was run on salty money. But let's swing back west for a moment. In England, salt played a quieter but still crucial role. Salt production sites like those in Cheshire became economic engines, and local barons grew rich controlling the salt pans. It wasn't glamorous, but it worked. Salt guilds regulated quality, pricing, and distribution. In some towns, the salt trade underwrote market fairs, cathedral expansions, and even castle maintenance. Salt didn't just preserve Metit, preserved medieval infrastructure. And then there's Venice. Ah, Venice, the glittering jewel of maritime trade, floating on brine and ambition. Venice didn't mine, Saltit mastered it. The Venetians built artificial salt pans across their lagoon and turned them into a strategic asset. In the 13th and 14th centuries, the Republic of Venice used salt to dominate Mediterranean trade routes, treating the commodity like an imperial chess piece. Entire treaties were negotiated not over land, but over access to Venetian salt. Quirky tidbit: in 1281, the Venetians signed a salt trade agreement with the city of Paduanli to later flood Padua's salt pans to enforce their monopoly. Yes, they weaponized salt scarcity. It was economic warfare by evaporation. Historians still argue whether salt wealth helped Venice rise as a major naval power, whether it merely amplified an already shrewd trading class. But one thing's clear: salt was a cornerstone of Venetian diplomacy, commerce, and empire building. Now glance south to Africa. In the Saharan heartland, salt was literally money. Timbuktu, Gao, Tagazathes cities rose not from fertile plains but from trade. Caravans of camels, sometimes hundreds strong, crossed the desert hauling slabs of salt from the mines of the Sahara to the markets of West Africa. In exchange, gold, salt for gold. No metaphor, no exaggeration, real gold, traded weight for weight with salt. Some Arab traders even referred to Tagaza's salt mines as the gold of the desert. Mansa Musa, the legendary ruler of Mali, controlled both gold and salt routes. That's like owning the oil fields and the shipping ports today. No wonder he could afford to destabilize the Egyptian economy with his charitable gold giveaways during his pilgrimage to Mecca in 1324. Meanwhile, in the Holy Roman Empire, salt mining towns like Holstadt and Hallein in modern-day Austria became boom towns. The very word salary, as we hinted earlier, may derive from salarium Roman compensation for soldiers, possibly intended to cover salt expenses. Whether that's etymologically airtight is still debated, but the connection between salary and salt stuck, reinforcing the idea that salt was more than food, it was value. And value attracts power. Salt works were guarded. Salt caravans had escorts. Salt vaults were real. If you controlled salt, you could extract taxes, influence trade, and fund armies. And everyone from popes to pirates wanted in on the game. Let's not forget religion. Salt offerings appear in both Christian and Jewish ritual. In medieval Christian liturgy, salt symbolized incorruptibility and purification. It was used in baptisms and holy water. Monasteries often controlled salt pans and sold the product to local lords. And, perhaps unsurprisingly, they didn't always pay tax on it. Divine exemption, conveniently applied. So, as you imagine yourself, now a medieval merchant navigating narrow streets, guiding a donkey cart loaded with salt, you realize this isn't just cargo. It's your ticket to power, your invitation to the high table. Salt has made you relevant. You smell it in the sacks. You hear it crunch beneath the cart wheels. You see it sparkle faintly under torchlight. And you understand now, salt wasn't the garnish of history, it was the foundation. And as we press forward, we'll explore the cultural echoes that salt left behind, not in war, not in tax rolls, but in language, tradition, and spiritual practice. Because salt didn't just shape economies, it shaped identities. The wind is calmer now. You've stepped out of the marketplaces and away from the mines. The salt is no longer clinking in coin purses or lining the shelves of tax collectors' offices. Instead, it lingers in kitchens, in customs, in stories whispered across time. Tonight, we're leaving the economics behind. Now it's time to trace salt's cultural legacy, how it flavors not just food, but identity. You walk into a medieval kitchen. The fire crackles in a stone hearth. Iron pots swing over low flames. A wooden table is dusted with flour. And on the corner of that table sits a little carved bowl smooth, well used, filled with coarse white crystals. Salt, always salt. Even in times of scarcity, it was never too far from hand. A pinch for preservation, a pinch for taste, a pinch to chase away bad luck. Because salt wasn't just food, it was magic. Mainstream historical fact, in medieval Europe, salt was considered a symbol of purity and protection. People sprinkled it on thresholds to ward off evil spirits, used it in wedding ceremonies, and carried it in small pouches as talismans. In Christian rites, it was often mixed with holy water, or applied directly during baptism. To be worth your salt was more than a compliment, it was a statement of your value, your character, your strength. And here's where it gets fascinating. Salt sat at the crossroads of superstition and science. Salt was believed to heal wounds, stop bleeding, and drive out demons. Midwives rubbed newborns with salt to protect them from harm. Warriors poured it into battle wounds not because it helped, it didn't, but because it was thought to purify. In folk medicine, it was both cure and curse used, in poultices, in rituals, in curses etched into stone. And then there's language. You probably use salt-derived phrases every day without realizing their medieval roots. Salt of the earth? That's from the Bible, but medieval sermons carried it forward, a compliment for the most virtuous of commoners. To take something with a grain of salt? That idea that a little salt could neutralize poison shows up in ancient Roman texts, and was retold in medieval apothecaries. Salacious. Yep, that's from sal, Latin for salt, but in this case tied to lustful or spicy gossip. Salt wasn't just a seasoning, it was a mood. Here's your quirky tidbit. Spilling salt was a very big deal. In medieval superstition, spilling salt was considered incredibly unlucky. Why? Well, because salt was sacred, expensive, and symbolic. Wasting it wasn't just clumsy, it was spiritually dangerous. That's why, to this day, some people still toss a pinch over their left shoulder after a spilto blind the devil sneaking up behind them. Historians still argue whether this specific ritual predates Christianity or was popularized during the Renaissance. One theory points to Da Vinci's The Last Supper, where Judas is shown having just knocked over the salt, a visual foreshadowing of betrayal. But whether Da Vinci invented the link or merely illustrated an existing belief, the connection stuck. Spill salt, invite misfortune. Now think about salt's place at the medieval table. It wasn't casually tossed around like today's pepper packets. In a noble household, the salt cellar vessel holding salt was a sign of status. A grand, often gilded container sat at the center of the table. And where you sat in relation to that salt bowl, that was your social ranking. Above the salt, you were honored, high-ranking, trusted. Below the salt, you were staff, or worse, a guest of low importance. It's one thing to know your placettes, another to have it defined by condiment geography. This practice was so entrenched that even some medieval wills listed salt cellars among prized family heirlooms. Imagine passing down a spoonful of salt like it was the family sword, but in a way, it was. Salt was power, and in a world where food was survival and rank meant everything, that power was visible. And visible salt often meant blessed salt. During major feasts or religious ceremonies, salt was sanctified before meals, not just for flavor, but to invite divine favor. In monasteries, Benedictine monks were known to pray over their salt stores, treating it as a gift not merely of earth, but of heaven. In this way, salt became a link between the material and the divine edible holiness. Even in funeral rites, salt made an appearance. Some traditions sprinkled salt on the body or in the grave to protect against corruption. In regions of Eastern Europe and some parts of England, mourners carried salt in small pouches to ward off spirits that might linger during burial processions. The belief was clear: salt didn't just preserve meat, it preserved dignity. It kept the soul on the straight path. And here's the part no one really talks about. Salt traveled with the people. When medieval peasants relocated, whether due to war, famine, or work, they often carried small bags of salt wrapped in cloth, not for cooking, for home, a pinch in the corner of a new hearth, a sprinkle at the foot of a new doorway. Salt wasn't just a resource, it was a tether, a ritual act of continuity, of bringing the sacred with you when everything else was uncertain. That's the quiet legacy of salt. Not shouted in history books, not detailed in royal records, but etched in habits, in whispers, in kitchen lore, and bedtime warnings. You pause now, standing outside a medieval farmhouse under starlight. A faint breeze stirs the thatched roof. The cooking fire has burned low. But inside, on the table, next to a candle stub and a wooden bowl of dried lentils, there it is, a small clay dish filled with salt, a silent promise of flavor, safety, and sanctity. Salt didn't just feed bodies. It nourished belief. Dawn creeps back over the hills, and with it, the slow, clattering stir of wagons, hooves, and boots on frost-hardened dirt. You follow a narrow path through a wooded stretch where your breath puffs visibly, and the scent of pine mixes with something sharper salted hides. You're not just walking alongside travelers now. You've joined a medieval salt trade caravan. And it's big. Dozens of pack animals, heavily laden with sacks of coarse salt, form a moving procession between one settlement and the next. Some of this salt came from mountain mines, some from coastal flats. All of it is headed toward cities that can't get enough of it. You hear no singing, no joking, just focused movement, like a small army hauling crystallized necessity. Because for medieval trade, salt wasn't just a commodity, it was infrastructure. Let's set the historical stage. The most famous of these medieval salt routes in Europe was the Via Salaria, a Roman holdover still used well into the Middle Ages. It ran across Italy, linking the Adriatic coast to inland markets. In France, there was the Route de Sel, connecting salt works in western regions to the heartlands. Germany had the Old Salt Road, Alte Salzstraße, stretching from the salt mines of Lüneburg all the way to Lübeck, powering the Hanseatic League's bustling economy. In Africa, it was even more extreme. Imagine this. You're crossing the Sahara with camel caravans laden with slabs of salt. Why? Because in West Africa, particularly in the Mali, empire salt was so valuable that it was sometimes traded ounce for ounce with gold. Let that settle in for a moment. Salt for gold. Not because it was rare, but because it was irreplaceable, life-saving, transportable, tradable across kingdoms, climates, and cultures. This brings us to your mainstream historical fact. The trans-Saharan trade routes of the medieval period were among the most critical arteries of commerce and communication in the pre-modern world. Salt mined in Tagaza or Taudeni was carried on camelback for weeks across searing desert to cities like Timbuktu, where it was exchanged for textiles, horses, and you guessed it, gold. The salt trade made cities and broke them. It fed empires. You walk beside a trader now. His tunic is patched, his boots cracked, but strapped to the back of his donkey is a single, flat slab of rock salt-etched and heavy. He tells you it's bound for a lord's pantry 4 towns over, and he's counting on it buying enough silver to pay taxes and fix the roof before winter. It's not glamorous, but it's real. And it was protected. Quirky tidbit, some salt convoys were so important that they had military escorts. In France, special salt inspectors called Gabalus enforced royal salt taxes and protected trade routes from bandits. These guys were part customs agent, part police force, and part local villain depending on whether they were guarding your shipment or taxing it. The gabelle, France's infamous salt tax, became so hated that centuries later it helped fuel the French Revolution. Historians still argue whether salt monopolies truly helped stabilize states or just enriched the elite at the expense of everyone else. In China, state control over salt production was an ancient tradition, but by the medieval period, it had evolved into a sprawling bureaucracy that provided essential revenue for the Tang and Song dynasties. Entire books were written about how to manage it. Salt wasn't just seasoning, it was strategy. Back in Europe, you arrive with the caravan at a bustling market. Stalls overflow with turnips, dried herbs, nuts, and a lot of suspicious-looking cheese. But the salt merchant heads for the stone-built guild house, where salt is weighed, taxed, and logged before it can be sold. That's the rule. Break it, and you're out not just from the guild, but from the whole economy. You slip inside, and the smell of salt overwhelms everything. It burns your nose, dries your throat. You see scribes hunched over parchment, tallying crates. You see guards counting coins. And tucked in the corner, a small Shrinier candle, a bowl of water, and a pinch of salt scattered on the ground. A blessing? Maybe. Or a bribe for luck. In some towns, salt markets had their own feast days, religious ceremonies, blessings of the salt. Entire festivals were built around its arrival. A year's worth of meat might rot without it. A monastery's larder might collapse. A town's winter survival might depend on one wagon getting through. Now imagine bad weather. A frozen pass, a bridge out, salt delayed by days. That's not a delay. That's a crisis. In fact, you could say salt caravans were the original supply chain drama queens. If one shipment didn't make it, bakers couldn't bake, butchers couldn't preserve, and trade ground to a halt. You don't appreciate that until you see the relief on a baker's face when a bag of salt finally arrives. You're standing there now, watching a deal close. One merchant passes over a purse, another hands over a stack of wrapped salt bricks. Hands shake, heads nod. Behind them, children play in the shadows, unaware that their winter porridge just got saved by a haggling session and a good mule. As the sun lowers, the market starts to empty. The caravan men lead their animals into the inn yard. Fires are lit, bread is broken. And once again, a small bowl of salt appears on the table shared between strangers who carried it, sold it, taxed it, and prayed over it. This is what trade looked like in the Middle Ages. Not stock tickers and cargo ships, but weary feet, stubborn beasts, and stone-walled markets full of noise and hope. Salt was the common thread, and maybe still is. It's night again, and you're still walking, but this time it's not on stone-paved roads or market streets. You're walking through a memory, one stitched into the daily rituals of medieval life, hidden in kitchens, whispered in fields, and kept in carved wooden boxes next to bread and prayer books. This is where salt lived most of its life, not on trade routes or tax ledgers, but at the table, in the hearth, on the tongue. Because beyond power, beyond preservation, beyond politics, salt was personal. You find yourself inside a medieval peasant cottage, smoke curling through a hole in the thatched roof, and every surface dusted with soot or straw. A woman crouches near the fire, stirring a pot with slow, practiced motions. The smell? Broth. Weak, but hearty. Inside is turnip, maybe onion, whatever the garden allowed. And beside her hand, in a tiny clay dish, is a pinch of white salt. Not much, just enough to matter. And that was often the case. Salt was precious. It was hoarded, hidden, rationed. In poor households, it was measured with care, sometimes literally counted grain by grain, but it was also sacred. Families believed that spilling it brought bad luck. Some sprinkled it over their threshold to keep spirits away. Others tossed it into the fire as an offering. Salt didn't just flavor food, it flavored belief. Here's your mainstream historical point. Salt was vital to medieval diet, not just for taste, but for health. It supplied essential sodium in a time before vitamins or fortified foods. People didn't know the chemical reasons, they just knew they got sick without it. Monks recorded its use in remedies for everything from sore throats to wounds. Soldiers rubbed it into cuts to prevent infection. Yes, it stung. Yes, it worked. And speaking of monks, you step into a monastery, now cool stone walls, candlelight flickering, rows of herbs drying in the apothecary. A friar dips a cloth in salt water to clean a chalice. Another prepares a salt-cured fish to serve on a fasting day. In these sacred halls, salt was both tool and symbol. It preserved the monastery's food. It symbolized purity. And it kept the cellar from becoming a petri dish of sin and salmonella. Salt appears in religious texts, too biblical and otherwise. In Christianity, followers were called the salt of the earth. In Judaism, salt sealed sacred covenants. In Islam, it was part of purification rites. And in pre-Christian Europe, salt circles protected against witchcraft. It bridged faiths, cultures, and even meals. Sharing salt with someone was a promise of peace, of trust. You don't attack the person you break bread and salt with. You sit at a lord's table now. This isn't a peasant's home, it's a hall of banners and firelight. A long wooden table groans under platters of roasted meats, spiced pies, and jugs of ale. And at its center, in a carved silver bowl, sits the salt. It glows in the firelight like treasure. And it is. There's even a phrase for this: above the salt and below the salt. At feasts, the salt cellar was placed in the middle of the table. Nobles sat above it closer to the host. Lesser guests sat below. It wasn't just about seasoning, it was about status. A medieval salt shaker doubled as a social barometer. Here's your quirky fact. Some medieval aristocrats carried personal salt, spoonstony ornate utensils just for serving themselves without common contact. Hygiene? Maybe. Ego? Definitely. Historians still argue how widespread this kind of etiquette really was, whether every noble dined this way, or only the very richest. But we know this. Salt shaped behavior. It determined where you sat, how you cooked, what you preserved, and even how you swore loyalty. To eat someone's salt was to enter their protection. To deny someone salt, that was an insult with sharp political teeth. And when it ran out, well, then came the real hardship. You find yourself walking now with a shepherd in winter. His sheep are gaunt, his fingers cracked, the snow crunches beneath your boots. And he is cursing not the weather, not the wolves, not even the taxes, but the salt shortage. His salted meat ran out last week. The roads are frozen. His neighbors have none to spare. And without salt, his last stores of meat and cheese will turn to mush in days. This is not a metaphor. It's survival. Salt famine was real. In lean years or wartime, when salt couldn't be traded or was taxed too high, communities suffered. Malnutrition crept in. Spoiled food led to disease. In more than one recorded famine, it wasn't food that ran out first, it was the salt to keep it edible. You return to the hearth, where a child sneaks a crust of bread and dips it in the salt dish like it's honey. His eyes light up. His mother doesn't scold him. She smiles. Because salt is comfort. It's memory. It's continuity. It's the story passed down not just by kings or crusaders, but by cooks, farmers, nuns, and blacksmiths. It's the detail in the background of every great event, quiet, essential, and overlooked until it's gone. Tonight, you've walked through centuries of salt, from taxes to temples, battlefields to bakeries. Its crystals have glittered across the pages of human history, not loud, but lasting. And even now, your kitchen shelf, your favorite soup, your mother's old recipe. It's still there, a pinch at a time, the oldest ingredient, the first preservative, the last reminder of when flavor and survival were the same thing. So tonight, when you sit down for dinner, maybe sprinkle a little extra. And whisper thanks. Now, everything slows. The air feels warmer, thicker, like the story itself is tucking you in. The torches are dim, the feast is finished, the monks have stopped chanting, the market stalls are shuttered. All that's left is the quiet pulse of memory. You lie back now, gently, as if on straw-stuffed linen. You can almost hear the wind brushing through the thatched roof above you. Somewhere, in the corner of the darkened room, a salt dish still waits shaft full, half forgotten. Its grains catch the candlelight just once before everything fades to shadow. The world you've travelled, Tonitov, nobles and navies, kitchens and cathedrals, is quiet now, but its taste lingers. A taste both sharp and soft, like the edge of a story remembered in your bones. Salt wasn't just seasoning, it was meaning. It still is. So breathe slowly. Let your thoughts settle like crystals in a still pond. There's nothing more to chase, nothing more to preserve. Just rest. History can wait. Tonight, the past watches over you, silent, steady, like a grain of salt on the tongue. Sleep well. The Middle Ages will still be here in the morning.